Good afternoon. My name is Dan Corey, and I'm with AECOM, and I have the privilege of speaking with our three panelists today to talk about how technology is changing, especially in the realm of autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, and other emerging technologies. Today, what we're going to do is each panelist is going to have about 5 minutes to talk about what their company is doing in the realm of autonomous vehicles. They're going to sit down, going to have a panel discussion, bring up some topics, how autonomous vehicles and land use work together, and how we see that moving toward in the future. And then as we're having those conversations, we're going to bring up, give you guys an opportunity to have some Q&A with us. One thing that I believe, and we were just sharing with our panelists before, is that as we bring up a topic, please raise your hands. Now, I know it's kind of tough for us to see hands raised here, but if you do have a question, please feel free. Interaction is the best type of session, and we see that we have a lot of people here, so obviously this is a hot topic to talk about. So we'll start off. And for those who have never seen me present before, this is going to be like this might be like a church session, because I like to walk around for a lot of reasons. One, I just can't stand still, and two, I just have a lot of nervous energy, so this helps me out as I talk. So my name is Dan Corey. I work for AECOM, and I'm out of our Philadelphia office, and I have the privilege of being our national ITS, which stands for Intelligent Transportation Systems practice lead. So we're going to talk a little bit about AECOM. For those who don't know, AECOM is one of the world's leaders in providing a complete solution, integrated solution. And what that means is going from an idea's conception to the planning stage, through the design, actually the finance as well, to the construction, to operations and maintenance, is what we like to do throughout the world in all realms, especially in the transportation industry, which is where I'm in. And there's 3 main objectives that we look for when we do this. One is sustainability, making sure that the solutions we provide are sustainable for not just the short term, but for the middle and long term in that 20+ year range. Second, it's linking communities. And I think you're going to see that a lot in connected and automated vehicles as we talk about this later on, as how we're bringing those communities together by this automation. And third, after the first 2 comes growth, and being able to grow the community as far as economic development, which I think is a topic that many of you would be enjoying today, as well as showing educational promise, as well as personal growth. So there's a bunch of questions up here that we've been receiving over the past several years about autonomous vehicles. How many people here are in the public sector? Raise your hand. All right, I see about 10. Perfect. A lot of questions that we're getting is, how do I plan for this? How are autonomous vehicles going to affect my city? Cities such as Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles. How do we plan? How do we have those policies put together? One of the things that AECOM has put together is a web application called Mobilytics. Being launched next week, so you guys are one of the first to hear, Mobilytics will take transportation demand management functionalities, combine it with our expertise in planning, design, and construction, and operations and management and maintenance, and create outcomes that will show how the potential effects or impacts of autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, and other technologies make within your city. What you'll be able to do is to hop online, click a city like Detroit, see the existing trend lines that have been put together from the different census data that we've gathered, plus other transportation data, and plot to show how CVs and AVs work together, and how they reduce potentially delay, how they could change the workforce, how they can make economic improvements and the amount of those economic improvements to that city. And what do we do after that? And for me, I'm on the design side of the house, where I've done technology deployments for over the past 20 years. So AECOM starts looking at this and says, one of our first roles is to go in to improve the infrastructure. Vehicles are going to start communicating with one another as they do now. Connected vehicles and automated vehicles share data. How do we improve the infrastructure right now to accept that data? How do we utilize the existing right-of-ways to lay fiber optic cable down to transmit that data? And how is that monetized over the future and the present? Then we start looking at the impacts of roadway design. This is, how many people know the distance you're supposed to follow if you're going 50 miles an hour? How far should you be to the car in front of you? 5 car lengths. Anyone say 1 car length? How many people have 5 car lengths that they keep? How many people keep 2 car lengths? How many people are police in this room that are going to start? Yes, 5 car lengths. So now with connected and automated vehicles, we can reduce that headway, that distance between both vehicles, because we've now included a larger safety factor, because now we've taken the human out of it, and the human is basically responsible for about 80% of incidents we see on the roadway. So now we have safer platooning vehicles together. We don't have to have that 12-foot lane anymore. How do we start reutilizing that right-of-way for the future? And one of the biggest impacts we've seen on this is who was around when we had toll plazas. Remember those? Now we don't need them anymore. And what do? We redevelop that land for the purpose of the public or a public-private partnership. Hyperloop is another technology that I just want to talk about today. Anyone heard of Hyperloop? Okay. So Hyperloop is a magnetic levitation transportation system by using inline electric propulsion. What that does is allows us to move goods and people at the speed of airplanes on land. So there's a distance between Dallas and Austin, Texas, about 200 miles. Hyperloop will take you through that distance in 19 minutes. How does that start changing how we look at land use? How we can now move different goods and services faster? How does that change what we need to think about as we start doing more planning? Automated shuttles, I'm going to have the experts really talk about this one, but the biggest thing that I see on those is that we're doing that last mile connection. And I'll give you an example. In Philadelphia, we've got an existing subway line that ends at the stadium of the world champion Philadelphia Eagles. But just south of that, about 3/4 of a mile, is a naval yard that constructed World War I and World War II ships. That has now started. That land has that Navy yard was closed, and now we're reusing that land where we have different companies and corporations having their major headquarters. How do we get people from that transit location to that location? So utilizing those shuttle services are a way that we can start seeing how to get people back and forth. And then finally, my last one, and this will be a great time for Sherif, who will be after me, is vehicle electrification. And no, AECOM is not creating an electric vehicle. That's not what we do. But what we're working on in the future that we see is that right now you have about in 2025, you'll have about 10% of electric vehicle penetration in the market. By 2035, you're looking at maybe over 30% of penetration. How do we reuse the land for doing electric charging? We have static charging right now, stations, but what AECOM is working on right now is a way of dynamically charging as you're driving. So those are just some of the technologies that we're doing at AECOM. I'm going to pass things on to Sherif. He's going to talk about what's going on with Ford. Sherif.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll do the same thing you were doing, so I'll stand here. What I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about, there's a lot of discussions and maybe a bit of hype on autonomous vehicles. My role at Ford is making autonomous vehicles real and creating a business working with cities on making autonomous vehicles work for both the city and the company and the industry. So we're announced in this case, and every company has a different timeline. Our timeline is getting an autonomous vehicle working in service in 3 years from now, so in 2021. What we realized very quickly is there's 2 different challenges with autonomous vehicles. The first one is the technical piece, which is very important, and it's all the software and the development and the integration, actually creating an autonomous vehicle that runs reliably, safely in the different areas that we plan to run the vehicle. The second thing, which is equally important, is actually the service, the city, and where autonomous vehicles are being deployed, and what are they actually doing? So assuming we have an autonomous vehicle, we figure out the technology, we figure out everything on running an autonomous vehicle, what do we do with it? And how does it integrate within a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today? And what's the landscape of the environment that autonomous vehicles are working in? Reality is, I think it's going to keep progressing and changing over many years. And I want to give you today just one example that we already started to do. And where we started earlier this year is we said, okay, we know that to have an autonomous vehicle, level 4 that is, we could talk about that later, what that means, but it's basically no driver in a fleet type service. So without a driver, there's a lot of things that people do that they will not be available to do, or people will be doing something else now. So we went to Miami. We picked Miami as our first city, and we're going to be announcing another city later this year. And what we're doing is we actually start experimenting and building the business in Miami, and there was a lot of criteria that went into that, including the city and how progressive the city is and how they think about their infrastructure and what's going to happen in the future and what they need to do. Of course, urban environment, center city, also some of the suburbs. So we looked at the businesses, we looked at the environment, we worked with the city to understand traffic patterns and things like that. And then we put in a terminal, a depot, a few miles away from downtown, because that's got to be close, where we're going to be dispatching autonomous vehicles to do service. So why create, and that's a real estate, that's a building that we picked, and we thought a lot about where that building is going to be, what we're going to do out of that building, and there are a lot of things that we're doing out of that building, including servicing the vehicles, dispatching the vehicles, downloading and uploading the data that comes from autonomous vehicles. So there are a lot of technical people, support people that are there in the building to do that. Of course, that require call centers. Now we're going to get into what kind of work do we need to do on a vehicle that doesn't have a driver, and can we do some of that work or park some of these vehicles actually in different places. So similar to what we were talking about earlier, we believe that some of the real estate and some of the areas that are doing certain things in cities today will be repurposed for other reasons. I mean, think about parking structures, gas stations, different curb parking, then depots. And you certainly, for simple things you need to do with an autonomous vehicle, you don't want the car to travel many miles to go do it in a center and then come back. So there are a lot of things that we're going to learn, and we're already starting to learn. We actually have vehicles running out of that building, going into the downtown area, doing some, moving goods in this case. That's something that we already started to do with some of our partners. And we're doing that with non-autonomous vehicles, because autonomous vehicles aren't here. We're testing the business, we're testing the work with the city, and we're doing that work in parallel to the technology being developed. The one common thing that brings those two together is the technology requires, in the first generation of autonomous vehicles, require heavy compute and processing on board in vehicle, does not rely as much on smart cities and infrastructure, and therefore it also requires high definition mapping in the areas where the autonomous vehicle is going to be running. So you can't randomly pick streets or go anywhere. With level 4, this is geofence in certain places. And we have to figure all that out for the next few years. Otherwise, we don't have a business. That's why it's critical, or working with the city. So we really believe that autonomous vehicles are a lot more complex than the technology that goes into the car. The next thing we're thinking about, this is beyond the first generation, is a lot of, and this is really for working with cities, is the smart infrastructure, and again, another area that we're all keen to understand, especially as city planning is looking at the future. There's brick and mortar and things you can do like we've been doing for many years, or there's smart infrastructure, simple things like autonomous vehicles don't really need traffic lights if there's transponders to know this is where you need to stop. And then you can actually reduce a lot of the processing and the technology that goes in the vehicle if you actually have things to tell you what's going on around you. Vehicle to vehicle and infrastructure to vehicle and all kinds of technologies. And really, when people talk about, okay, when is it going to be ready, this is not an in or out. This is going to be a situation where certain cities are going to adopt certain technologies, working with automotive companies for autonomous vehicles, and then we're going to progressively improve, which means reducing the amount of things happening in the vehicle and relying more on the infrastructure. And we really think that's going to be an area that will continue to progress. Hopefully, that is actually better for everybody because that reduces actually the infrastructure that goes in, but initially requires a different kind of infrastructure. So first generation is what we're working on. Excited about doing the business, looking at the landscape, building, working out of depots and things like that. Next is going to be the smart infrastructure and what happens around the vehicle, and then how the vehicle reacts, and then they have to happen together as we start changing what the vehicle is processing and looking around the vehicle and relying more on what's happening around the vehicle. Exciting times. I know there's a lot of hype around autonomous vehicles, but really it's a very complex set of technical business and working closely with cities, even as simple as understanding traffic patterns. Where do you deploy the vehicle at what time to do what? That could actually help the city, it can help the service, and it can help everybody. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Sherif. Alisyn.
All right. I'm going to come down as well. Keep everyone entertained this afternoon right after lunch, right?
You got it.
So, Alisyn Malek, I'm with May Mobility. We are a self-driving transportation services company. And Sherif's discussion was a really great tee-up. Our company is focused on bringing communities together with self-driving transportation and really taking a community-focused approach as we launch, working with what works in the technology today. My founding team, so I'm the Chief Operating Officer with May Mobility. My founding team and I have extensive background both in automotive and in self-driving technology. And with our backgrounds, we know that there's a lot of things that do work and there's a lot of things that don't work. So what we're aiming to do with May Mobility is bringing self-driving transportation to communities, leveraging what does work today in self-driving tech. So to Sherif's point, we can't do whole cities. That doesn't work. But we can come in and do parts of cities, do neighborhoods, do specific, commute routes. Can we come in and solve some of those basic pain points, help to get your communities comfortable with this form of transportation, and then scale out from there? We've talked a lot with different communities about what they're interested in, what we could do to help solve the challenge. And we realize that it's not just about the vehicles and the technology and all of the big press releases. It really is about making sure that this is easy to adopt for any of the communities that you're developing or any of the cities that you guys are working in. We try to have discussions about how do we make it easy. The future is autonomous. We're on the way there, but we need to bring everyone along for this ride. So how do we make it easy for you, for your cities, and for your riders to be able to use this transportation? So part of it is about our vehicle, which is very reliable and capable. Another part of it is about site operations. We too stand up operations to support our deployments. And lastly, we have a software interface. It allows us to manage our fleets and have sort of that overarching view, but it also allows our partners to understand what level of transportation service they're getting. Are we moving the right number of people in the right directions? Are we having the right impacts in terms of either congestion or if you can reduce parking in a new high-rise that's coming in? Part of making sure that we're meeting the goals for the communities is making sure that we're bringing that information up and talking with you all and with your city partners about what are the outcomes that we want. Not that we want AV in the community, that's nice, but what are the transportation outcomes that we want to achieve? We've actually done deployments. So we did a demonstration here in Detroit last October, working with Bedrock, who I'm sure after 3 days of this, most of you know who they are, through the Detroit tours. They run shuttles that move people from office buildings to parking garages. They run 9 different shuttle routes. In October of last year, we actually took over one of the shuttle routes. So instead of people getting off of work and getting, and finding the 30-passenger bus that would take them to their parking garage, 220 people showed up and got into a self-driving shuttle. That gave us an opportunity to start to learn about what it means to have operations, but it also gave us an opportunity to start to look at what riders need. How do we make sure that our developer and city partners have the right level of insights and confidence in the transportation that we're providing, that it's safe, that it's reliable, and it's moving people? But how do we also build the confidence in the riders? We had probably 20 people that didn't want to get on the car, and we didn't force them, but we did talk with them, engage them, talk with them about their fears. They rode in the vehicle, and by the time we let them out at their parking structure, they were all smiles. And they were our biggest champions by the end of the week in terms of convincing people to get in the car. So when we talk about AV as the future, it is. But again, if you're thinking about adopting new transportation into your communities, make sure that you're thinking about the riders as well, so we can bring everyone along for this adventure. We've also done demonstrations in places like Tampa, Florida, working directly with the transit agency. They have a transit way that runs perpendicular to a couple of bus rapid transit lines, and wanted just a simple shuttle to be able to help connect those lines. We came in and we were able to do that demonstration very well. A lot of communities are excited about AVs, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Finding the right partner for your needs is really key in terms of being able to operate on your existing road network with your existing traffic. There aren't too many companies out there that can do that, so be cognizant as you're picking partners. This talks a little bit about where we're going. So I talked about the shuttles and gaining confidence. That's where we start. So we as May Mobility are starting as a transportation service provider in 1 to 3 mile trip distances. That isn't where we end. To get to the future of AV, that is great, that everyone can have exactly the level of transportation that they need everywhere all the time. This is a big challenge. That's even harder than getting the cars to drive themselves in the first place. But we're up for it. We think that this is the right first step to build that confidence, build that network around how to operate the business. And over time, you'll see that we'll have more platforms. It could be a 30-passenger bus or an 11-passenger vehicle, but we want to come in and work with communities to solve their overall transportation needs. So as we look towards the future, we're excited to work with communities, especially at looking how to create interconnect opportunities. I know a lot of people talk about, I don't want to build a new parking structure. We love those conversations. How can we help you use your existing parking assets better? That is available today. Everything AV all the time is well into the future. So as you're thinking about whether or not you want to adopt this type of thing into your community, it will be a phased approach. So don't worry, you don't have to completely upend your plans now, but it is good to think about it, and I'm excited to talk more in the conversation.
Alisyn, hi. All right, Valerie, Sathe, Brugeman. I work at the Center for Automotive Research, and you might be thinking, wow, automotive research, why am I at ULI? Well, interestingly, I've been a ULI member for several years because of some work I did years ago on repurposing former auto manufacturing facilities and looking at adaptive reuse with respect to industrial sites. So I'm thrilled to be here in this capacity as well, talking about mobility and how mobility is impacting land use. We at CAR, we're a nonprofit think tank, basically that explores every aspect of the automotive industry you can think of, one of which being increasingly mobility and how automotive plays into the broader mobility space. And we did some research last fall that was put out called Future Cities, and it specifically looked at how connected and automated vehicles and innovative mobility services are likely to impact communities. And these include things like zoning requirements, thinking about changing your mindset from a minimum level of parking requirements for a building to maybe thinking of a maximum level of parking spots for buildings, and including some forms of car sharing spots like a zip car or a car to go, to incorporate these into your planning process as you're thinking about new buildings. It includes things like parking. I think Alisyn mentioned that a little bit. Do you really need to invest in new parking, or are there going to be fewer vehicles that need to be parked? That's likely the future. And for the parking decks that you do need to invest in, maybe you should think about trying to make them flat so they can be more easily retrofitted to new uses. There's a great concept that an architecture firm put up, a concept picture showing automated vehicles parked very tightly in a parking structure, because of course they park themselves, so they don't need space for someone to get into and out of. So they're able to be more efficiently parked on one level of the parking structure. They showed office space on levels 2 and 3, and then they show people doing yoga on the top story. Of course, this is very much a concept. We don't know that that's necessarily coming, but we're thinking about these things, and it's important for land use professionals to be thinking about these things. One interesting item to note is a lot of simulation studies that estimate the impacts that connected and automated vehicles will have in the future, estimate that vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, will actually increase with these vehicles. Because all of a sudden, the cost of your travel time has been reduced significantly. Instead of driving and wanting to minimize the time that you're spending in a car, in traffic, et cetera, you could be doing anything else, any number of things in the vehicle. So all of a sudden, if that travel time cost is decreased for you, then you might wish to live farther out, sprawl might increase. Land use professionals need to start thinking about that. How do you mitigate the potential negative effects of autonomous or automated vehicles to discourage sprawl, to discourage more congestion as more vehicles come on the road, to discourage zero occupancy vehicles? Let's say you have an automated vehicle, it picks someone up and drops them off, and then it's driving around looking for the next person. How do you make that as efficient as possible so this car is not driving around empty, kind of like a taxi does now? But if you multiply taxis by tenfold and have that many more vehicles on the road, you're going to be creating more problems. So these are just some of the items to think about. I know we're going to get into some of the discussions more, but I'm very happy to be here, and happy to discuss with my fellow panelists and with you.
Thank you, Valerie. Okay, so that was a basic overview of what each of us are doing with our respective companies. And it's funny, as the moderator, your job is to basically bring everyone together. And we had some basic questions that we said, well, maybe we'll throw these out to the group when we start. And when we got together, I asked people a couple of questions. I said, this is going to be more like a conversation, because as we've talked here, I think I've had about 8 different questions I want to bring up. And I think the biggest thing that you've seen from everyone here is we're talking about autonomous and automated vehicles. Does everyone know there's a difference between the two? Okay, so we're going to start with some basic things here, guys. So let's start off. Does everyone realize that in probably most of your cars, you have some type of automation? Raise your hand if your car has automation. Raise your hand if you have cruise control. Your car has automation. Guys, what I'm going to ask the panelists first is to talk about a little bit, we have levels 4 and 5 that we're trying to achieve. And Sherif, I'm going to start off with you. Tell us about a little bit with Ford, where they see themselves going from current levels to levels 4 and 5.
Yeah, we see the vehicles that we all drive with a certain level of automation as level 1, 2, 3. Those are, you have a driver, and then you can get more and more into the complexity of the automation and the levels where you can actually stay focused versus do other things. The more automation the vehicle can do, obviously the less the driver needs to do. But what we're talking about here is level 4, and then obviously there's level 5 following that. And level 4 is no driver, but it's also in geo-fenced areas, very specific, and we'd be deploying those to service people and goods to move things around. So there'll be passengers or there'll be goods in the vehicle to be delivered in specific locations. Level 5 would go, basically you remove that constraints. So based on, you could take the car anywhere, without a driver, and you can go anywhere in the US or around the globe. We're not at that level yet. We think that's just a progression, and the first thing is level 4. A lot of work, like we were talking earlier about HD mapping and knowing exactly where you are, the static map, the dynamic data that you're getting as the vehicle is driving is still at the stage where you need to do all that work and know exactly where you are and know the static objects on those streets that you're driving on. Therefore, it's still geofence. You still have to do that work. A lot of people say, well, when is level 5 going to be here? And honestly, I mean, we don't know. It depends on how fast we get to level 4 and how confident we are, and then you can continue to get, but it's level 4 we see as an important step towards level 5, which is the ultimate, automation, if you will, where you don't need you not only aren't you driving the vehicle, but you can push a button and the vehicle can go wherever you want to go.
And let me ask, again, this is part of the interactive part of our conversations here. Those in the audience, how many people have been in a self-driving car that's level 3, level 4, that there is no driver? Raise your hand. Okay. What are some of, thank you. What are some of the fears, and I'm going to go, Alisyn, to you, because I thought you brought up some very good points about getting the community involved and bringing the community along for the ride, no pun intended, which I thought was fantastic. How do you see the best way of engaging the community?
We see the best way of engaging the rider community through community leaders. And that is part of the reason why our approach is so focused at launch, is finding community leaders and partners that I've identified that they have a transportation need. So there's a pain point where people are like, okay, I need this transportation. Kind of gets them a little bit over the hurdle when they show up and it's self-driving. And then beyond that, again, it's still very much working with our partners to be able to reach out and work on education. There's a lot of education that needs to take place. We all just kind of trust that our vehicles are safe, and we know that because they've been around for hundreds of years, or 100 years plus, but we don't understand why. And getting confidence in self-driving technology almost brings us back to even learning about the cars that we drive today, and how they work and why they're safe. And so it's a dialogue, an exchange that needs to happen. So we're figuring out how to integrate some of that within our vehicles, but some of that is just straight groundwork before we even launch on a route.
And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we've looked to do as an industry, is to bring out those vehicles to people to get in, to feel, to touch. And I think even the legislators are probably a big part as we're searching for some type of federal legislation or down to state level legislation of how autonomous vehicles will be regulated. So being able to have that feel and touch, I think, is going to help move and progress this technology moving forward. I don't know if everyone noticed, but I think almost everyone here talked about parking. And I think this is probably the biggest thing that will relate to this group is, what do we do? I know, Valerie, you brought up VMTs, and that there's a few studies out there that are showing that probably maybe there'll be 20% less cars, but the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled of those cars, are going to be exponential to what they are today. So guys, talk to me about how you see curb space. How do you see how we have to change curb space? Where are the opportunities? And Valerie, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to work our way down.
There are a lot of opportunities that automated driving would bring in the sense of freeing up current road space for other uses. Being able to reduce the lane widths because you don't need the room for driver error because there's no driver except while the vehicle's driving itself, so it knows exactly what path it's on. Maybe you can shrink roads and create more, pedestrian paths, bike paths, food trucks, parking, who knows, but other uses for the roads, especially in more downtown or core areas. There's a flip side to that, though, because you'll have all of these communication, potentially, technologies, charging as well, and that all needs to be figured out where that is located. So you might be freeing up some road space for other uses, but your actual curb space, and especially thinking of pickups and drop-off loading zones with these vehicles, do people just get out anywhere, or is there a central spot that you want to designate as the place for people to get on and off, kind of like what you're seeing at airports now, where there's a designated ride-hailing area? Do you want that in your city as well? Probably makes sense, but...
And then tie that into, a lot of the big proponents of this automated technology are your elderly or those with that have physical challenges.
Yep.
So how do we change that curbside? I'll go to either Sherif or to Alisyn on what do you think that we do to change having those types of functionalities there for multiple types of people? I mean, you're talking about elderly, again, people with physical challenges. How do we have ADA ramps right now. What else do you think we need to have?
Well, I think the one thing that autonomous vehicles are going to do is like we were talking about earlier, we'll have vehicles. We're designing the first autonomous car to have hundreds of thousands of miles durability, meaning continuing running for a lot more miles in a short period of time. And just realize the automotive industry has not really been doing that for the last 100 years. It's more miles over a longer period of time because that's what people do. Most of us use the car 5% or less of our time. That takes it up to a different level. So that means you have the potential to actually cause more issues or less issues depending on how you're doing it. So that's why we believe that understanding and getting in with the city and understanding the city solutions that they're looking for, traffic patterns, rush hour, curb space, downtown areas, parking. Actually, every city, even though those are common things, but they're different in every city. And we think that figuring out, understanding these things, and then understanding the business, and understanding, we're talking about elderly and the neighborhoods in those areas, those cars can actually provide better service for those neighborhoods in times where that's the best place for them to be and provide that service. So it's a complex set of things, and I've seen a lot of models that can pretty much tell you anything you want to hear, but what's important is understanding those things result in a better way of deploying these vehicles. A very simple example, even from a human behavior standpoint of delivering things to people. We've already learned that, I mean, we've ran testing on some delivery in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in Miami, Florida, and it's very different, right? It isn't necessarily about the city, it's a suburbia versus downtown. If you're on a 20th floor of a building, you're probably going to have less inclination to go around the building to a curb to pick up your stuff versus in front of your house in a suburbia. So those are things that are real, and it means something to deploying autonomous car in different areas, and we actually almost have to have that as input as we figure out how we're going to run these autonomous cars.
Alisyn?
So I think we really relish engaging with communities early about equity and access. It's easy to solve transportation problems for people for whom this is a second option, and we'll definitely go solve those. We are in business and want to stay that way. But we also realize that to meet a community's whole needs, we have to think about everyone. And to really reach the end goal of autonomy, we have to think about everyone. So some of the interesting conversations that we've been having is understanding ADA requirements as they apply to not buses. ADA requirements are written at much more of a you shall do X, Y, or Z if you're a bus type of level versus you need to be accessible to a wheelchair. And that's actually created really interesting opportunities where we come into a community and they're like, we want you to meet ADA, and we're like, what does that mean to you? So we get to have good conversations about, well, can we create ramped curb space? Our cars don't sit that high off the ground, so could we do things like create ramped curb space rather than having our car emit a ramp? That would be honestly a bigger challenge. And then are there other forms of transit that could use that same ramped curb space? And so thinking creatively about, we know what the goals are. We know that we want to make sure that these vehicles are more accessible. We've already started to work a little bit for visual and auditory impairment, but how do we have a broader discussion about the whole world around people and how the vehicles can fit in as a part of that?
Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I think we've reached our time. I'd like a great round of applause for our panelists here.